Hi, I'm Robbie Diamond, the CEO and founder of SAFE. Thank you so much for joining us here today for our new series, China, Competition, Power. And as our first episode, China's hybrid economic system. I guess many people would ask why we're doing this. An organization that started with a focus on energy security and oil dependence. And really, this organization has always been about how do we live by our values? How do we make sure we have the resources and the economic capacity that we need to go forward? And we've focused on the economic and national security risk. And so China was never in our purview in the beginning. But then, as advocates for the electrification of transportation, so we'd have diverse fuel sources in our transportation system, it became obvious to us about 8 years ago that we'd go from the Saudi frying pan into the Beijing battery fire, so to speak. And suddenly we all had to become experts on China. And here we have today 4 people who really taught me everything I know about China, because they've lived this and experienced this over time. What struck me in the beginning as I was becoming to learn is, we all have this impression that they're 10 feet tall. We all think that they should be economic actors like us and profit maximizing actors. And to me, I think one of the problems that I had, and hopefully we'll be able to talk about and maybe dispel today, is that we all are raised on this idea of empathy, taking ourselves and projecting ourselves in someone else's shoes. And so we are profit maximizing actors. That's the way we've been taught to think about a lot of the world. But they are actually they're trying to maximize for something else, not necessarily profit. And it's really important to get into that mindset to understand how we do compete with them. And the other thing is to understand, as we're discussing now all over the world about this idea of overcapacity. It seemed like, oh my God, there's this big threat suddenly. But really, when you go back and you begin to look, as we'll talk about today, from now until now, we've had this idea of overcapacity. We can see this in industry over industry as they've taken them out, whether it be steel or aluminum or now solar panels and wind turbines and electric vehicles, semiconductors and everything else. So I think it's really important to understand that this is sort of an economic model. So what we're hoping today is to allow you all to understand what these great experts have seen over time of how they are thinking and acting, and then how do we both create the best of ourselves and our economic order, but also adjust ourselves to their economic order and how they're using our order against us. So with that, let me quickly introduce our 4 panelists. We start with Rick Switzer, who's a principal at ProjX. He previously had a career and a member of the Foreign Service. He was recently the Director of Policy and Strategy at the Special Envoy Office for Critical and Emerging Technology. He has both lived in China and lectured in China, worked at the embassy in Beijing. We have Liza Tobin, who's the Senior Director for Economy at the Special Competitive Studies Project. Before joining SCSP, she serves as the China Director at the National Security Council. And previously, she was a senior advisor at the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. We have Adam Frost, who is still recently was a senior vice president for China and Transformational Exports Program at the Export-Import Bank, which is a program, for those who don't know EXIM, focused on competing with China's subsidies in key export sectors, including quantum computing, renewable energy, and semiconductors. He also previously served on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And finally, my good friend David Feith, who is a principal at Garneau Global. And he is an adjunct senior fellow with the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for New American Security, and he previously served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Before that, he was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal in Hong Kong, as well as assistant editor of Foreign Affairs magazine. So it is really great to have all of you here. And I think what we're going to do today is really frame and talk through what is going on, how does China has competed over time historically, and what's the United States and our allies trying to do, and what do we ultimately need to do. This is the first of a series, so next month we'll bring another one. You can submit your questions. We're not going to take the questions today, but for the next one, we can start with some of your questions. So please feel free to send us your questions. So let me start with you, Rick. And Rick, thanks again for bringing up this idea to do this webinar. I think in many ways, what I'd like to happen is when we go to policymakers around the world and say to them, oh, you know, this is the way China thinks. This is why we have to care. This is what they've done over time. We can say, go watch this webinar. So this is very foundational. But you've been watching China as it's evolved. It's a unique, as we call it, the hybrid economic system. Can you give us some historical context about how the modern PRC has evolved and how we got to where we are today, as I say, from Mao until now?
That's a great way to put it, actually, Robbie. And thanks so much for having us here. This is an amazing panel. Liza, Adam, David. Very excited to talk about this. I think it's really important when we think about the hybrid economy, as I like to describe it, of the PRC. We have to go really way back. But before I start there, I think it's really, as you mentioned, sort of there are some policy misconceptions, particularly in Washington, D.C. And you know, I literally just heard both of these on Bloomberg radio within the last 3 weeks. And I would say both of them are false assumptions that continue to be sort of brought forward and used by folks throughout the DC community and Wall Street and elsewhere. The first is that China is more capitalist than the United States. That's sort of patently false. And I'll go into all the reasons of why that is. What we think of in the US when we think of a free market capitalist structure, we think of independent economic actors operating in a market structure outside the control of the government, outside of government ownership. Virtually every major company in China, whether they're nominally called private by the PRC government, and I'll describe why that's not true, are in some way either completely controlled, owned, or indirectly controlled by the government and the party. Another one that you hear quite often is that there's this unspoken agreement between the people and the party, and that as long as the party continues to deliver economic prosperity, that the people will continue to let them govern. Nothing could be further from the truth, actually. The reality is the exact opposite. Actually, during Deng Xiaoping's reform era, when he first announced the idea of reform and began to loosen up and create a more permissive environment for China's citizens, what he said was, let's let a few people get rich first. And what he's saying there is that the government will allow a small number of people to act as independent economic actors as long as they enrich the nation state. So it's actually the exact opposite of what you hear from folks. So the next time you hear someone say that there's this implicit agreement that the party delivers the goods and the people sort of turn the other way from politics, it's the exact opposite. The party loosened the tiny amount of reins for certain numbers of people to act as semi-independent economic actors as long as they delivered the goods that the party was looking for. So the two are patently false. So if you step back, and I'm going to try to take what was a 10-week course. So I taught a graduate course in National Intelligence University on China's economy. It was about 24 hours of lectures and about 5,000 pages of required reading. So folks who took my class, I apologize. But I'm going to try to condense many of the highlights of that into the next 10 minutes or so here. So if we look back at the founding, sort of from Mao to now, the first process that takes place is that the party collectivizes ownership, right, of land, farms, but they also go in and they take control of virtually every aspect of the economy, so that by the time you get to the middle of the Cultural Revolution, the party has absolute control. The government has absolute control of every aspect of the economy, whether it's land, whether it's production, all agriculture production, all natural resource production, oil, coal, iron, whatever it is, all the manufacturing firms, even the smallest of independent actors, even a farmer seeking to sell watermelons on the side of his property would have been arrested at certain times in the PRC's history. So what we have is this system where we start with a level of absolute economic control that is unheard of in almost any other economy. Even the Soviet economy didn't have quite the level of economic control that the Chinese were able to accomplish. And so that becomes the base. And from there, we have a series of plans. And so we have the 5-year plan. So they follow the old Soviet model of 5-year plans. And it's important to sort of understand how these 5-year plans play out over time and other major economic reforms play out over time, how they structure the now that we find ourselves in. And so by the time you get to the second 5-year plan, which is from 1958 and up through 1963, this is when the party has totalized much of the control. They've gone through a period where they encouraged foreign investors and some capitalists who were there prior to the Republic of China and the fleeing to Taiwan to actually stay, because they promised that actually they weren't going to take total control and that they needed them to help build the new state. That lasted about for the first 5-year plan, and then they flipped the switch in around 1957, 1956, and they began to take everything away. But one of the things that comes out of the second 5-year plan, which is sort of important to think about because it lays the sort of foundation for future 5-year plans, and we're up to 14th 5-year plan now. By 2025, we'll be entering the 15th 5-year plan. They continue to be very, very important for how China orders itself. But in the second 5-year plan, they begin the deep industrialization policy. And one of the things that folks sort of know about from this that people may not realize was actually a policy of the second 5-year plan is something that was called the Beijing, or the Great Leap Forward. And the Great Leap Forward, is a lot of people know a bit about it, but essentially it was an industrial policy that was designed to drive the ability to produce aluminum, steel, and iron, and a few other things. And that it went off the rails to the point that it actually caused a famine. And it caused a famine that killed upwards of 30 million people. It's important, again, to sort of start here, because that industrial policy that killed 30 million people did not lead to party reforming. It didn't lead to people, the party being kicked out. It didn't lead to the populace rising up against the Communist Party masters when they just literally killed 30 million people with a famine. What it did lead to was a very short period of market-based reforms by a guy by the name of Liu Shaoqi. He was rewarded for putting China back on track and ending the starvation by being placed under house arrest when Mao came back into power. But more importantly is that the original plan was never abandoned. Tactics changed, but it was never actually abandoned. From there, we move into the later 5-year plans and during the Cultural Revolution. And there's a massive investment in heavy industry. And this remains the core focus of the PRC to this day. The vast majority of the investment to this day that goes into heavy industry is far higher than any other economy in the world by orders of magnitude compared to, say, the United States. But this period is when that was sort of deeply inculcated. So there was almost no trade whatsoever. China was an actual exporter of oil. So the hard currency that they would actually accumulate during that period of time was used primarily to buy equipment, heavy manufacturing, factory-based equipment to build their heavy industry capacity. Bringing in the ability from Germany, for instance, were some of the early folks who were brought in the late 1960s during this time period to help build out truck building industries and build out steel stamping industries and sort of modernizing rubber and tire production and others. So because they weren't really trading with the Soviets at that point. But that was the only real trade going on. It was a small amount of commodity exports that provided hard currency that a government agency would then go and target where these industries are so they could build the foundations of the economy. From there, they quite literally, the deep planning, totalizing control, and hermetically sealed version that China had become had driven China into a state of sort of relative poverty. While a very large country, the GDP was still actually relatively large by East Asia standards, not by Western Europe and US standards. But the per capita GDP of China by the end of the Cultural Revolution is about the same as Ghana. And clearly the trajectories have shifted. And so this leads into the next level of reform, which starts under Deng Xiaoping. And again, I mentioned Deng earlier, and so Deng Xiaoping was actually a student of Liu Shaoqi, the guy who I mentioned who came in and sort of drew China out of starvation through some common sense market-based reforms. A few other folks were sort of acolytes of his, Zhao Ziyang, who ends up being the premier during Tiananmen, who's put under house arrest, and Deng Xiaoping was connected. So what they do is they go back to this idea of, well, how can we allow certain segments of the economy to operate in a market-based structure where we use the market to clear pricing, to clear competition, and to drive some investment in. And so the reform and opening up era, Gaiga Kaifeng era, that starts there is the beginnings of modern China. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't seek to privatize the massive state-owned enterprise infrastructure. It doesn't seek to create a private economy. What it seeks to do is to bring in foreign investment and to use the market as a clearing mechanism, and then to apply some modern management processes to these enterprises, and to allow private individuals to have space to operate as independent economic actors, right? And so this period, which many people think about as China opening up to the world, the reform and opening up era. But the reality is what it was always about was opening the world to China. China remains an exceptionally closed economy, and I'll get to that in the next few minutes as I go forward. That's very difficult to do business, and it was very difficult throughout this entire reform era. Many firms went in and lost a ton of money, and typically what they do, the firms that were allowed to come and stay and participate and benefit were firms that provided direct benefit towards the ongoing 5-year plan model. And so as the further 5-year plans begin to come together, the next sort of broad era of reform happens under Zhu Rongji, who was the person sort of in charge of the economy under Jiang Zemin. And so this era takes us roughly from about 1995-ish to about 2003. And this is probably the high watermark of open, permissive economic system in the PRC. But even then, anyone who was doing business in China in that period of time, as I was working with companies doing business there and then teaching at Beijing University, knew quite well that they were, even at the high watermark of openness to the rest of the world and a somewhat permissive economic environment that sort of begins to recapitulate back to or revert back to the mean after 2003 was very difficult, required incredible amounts of capital, and always had to be in the interests that met the interests of the 5-year plans. As we move from that era into the sort of the next era, we move into the Wen Jiabao era, and one of the really important pieces that happens here is the creation of the State-Owned Asset Supervision Administration Commission, or SASIC. And so what SASIC does is it becomes a super holding company for all the state-level, state-owned enterprises, the central government level state enterprises. At the time, it was about 140. It's been whittled down to about 94. These 94 companies that are under the control of SASIC today are about $30 trillion in assets. They did about 3.6 or 4.6 or 4.7 trillion dollars in revenue last year. To put that in context, those firms that are controlled by this super holding company called SASIC accounted for the equivalent of 25% of China's GDP in the previous year. Underneath the central level SASIC, there's also provincial level SASICs as well, where there's another layer of provincial level companies that are deeply embedded into the economy. And so this is why the US Chamber of Commerce a few years ago sort of made a statement that 50% of the Chinese economy is blocked completely for any foreign participation, and even nominally private Chinese firms. So from at the ante, 50% of the PRC economy is not open to any participation whatsoever. The rest of the 50% is roughly divided about 70-30, meaning that about 30% of what's left is potentially available for foreign investment and foreign ability to participate. But even there, it always requires, as WTO accession codified, it almost always requires joint ventures. Now, sometimes it isn't required by law, but no smart company goes in and tries to do business without a Chinese partner because it just doesn't work. From there, we get to the next era, and I'll try to speed this up. And again, as I said, this is literally 24 hours of lecture condensed to a very short period of time. The next phase begins really after that sort of 2005 through to about 2015. And this is the continuous sort of reassertion of the control of the state. But to be honest with you, many firms, Western firms, haven't yet paid attention or taken notice. So they still feel that there's business to be done there. And many that were already there continue to be able to do business there, but it's done on the terms of the party. If the party sees value in what you do, a la Apple. They will let you to sell there because you produce there and because your dependency is such that you're driving their own innovation system. From there, we get into the sort of more modern 5-year plans, and the ones that really I think folks began to take notice of were the 12th 5-year plan, where they began to target higher tech industries, and these are the industries that were dominated by Japan, the United States, Europe previously, and initially many in the U.S., Europe, and firms discounted it as these technologies are too advanced, they can't quite possibly do that. You get to the 13th 5-year plan, and that's when you get things like Mil-Sieve fusion and Made in China 2025. And what you get there, which is really important, is that they take the standard 5-year plan model, which is not profit-based, right? It's not market-based. It is, we are targeting global production numbers. So the semiconductor industry, for instance, is a good one. By 2025, according to the plan, China's consumption of semiconductors will be 80% produced in China, right? And that 50 or 60%, depending on the sort of segment, of global will be produced in China by Chinese firms. Well, that by nature is zero sum, right? That isn't, in order for them to meet their targets, which they don't always meet their targets, like the Great Leap Forward took them until 1993 to meet their targets. But over a long enough time horizon, Chinese industrial policy is undefeated. And so when they do meet their targets, and so as firms began to look at this, they said, oh, wait, that's my business. I'm already selling to you. So now you're saying that you're going to take away my business in China, much of which for semiconductors weren't really for the Chinese market. They were actually going into assembled finished products that were then leaving for a global market. And they're saying that, no, we want to take that as well. And that we want that to agglomerate to 50% of global. And that began to really cause a lot of firms to be very concerned, and policymakers. So that's sort of how we sort of end up where we are today. I think that's enough of the history to lay the foundation. But I think it's really important to sort of have that grounded history to understand that this is not a normal economy. This isn't a private sector economy. The Chinese government still controls indirectly or directly 70% of the economy. All the banks, all the insurance companies, you list and others. So
let me ask you a very quick question before I go to the others, which is, we've all been taught, and I do believe that capitalism is the best way to allocate capital. And that many times when we don't have capitalism and consumers aren't making decisions, and you're not profit maximizing firms, then you have problems. Meaning, like, you have, you could have famines or whatever. Okay, but here we are. They don't do that, but yet they're succeeding at the moment. And also, we're not succeeding, or in certain places like minerals, or maybe in certain types of commodities. Like, it was very, very quickly, like in a minute. Give a sense of, like, okay, so they're maximizing for this, and this is why they're being successful now. And our companies that are thinking like this are incapable of competing like that, either globally or inside China, because we're just thinking wrong about what they're doing. And yes, we don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but we have to do something different, which we'll get to throughout the discussion. But take 2 minutes and just put it into real terms of today.
Happy to. So markets work. That's the bottom. Like, the punchline is markets work. Free market capitalism is the most powerful system ever. But what you have here is, for instance, SASIC and why it works, right? SASIC will take, and this has happened many times, I give you examples. Dongfeng in Chongqing, for instance, went bankrupt. And because all of the things you just said, but because SASIC controls that, $30 trillion in assets and $4.5 trillion in revenue, the firms that are actually making money, and they're making money primarily off of monopoly control of the PRC market, that profit can then be driven back into keeping dead firms that would otherwise go bankrupt alive. Now, left to its own devices, that would have massive implications in long-term inefficiencies. But because they have unfettered access because of WTO, and to be honest with you, China's accession into WTO is probably the greatest economic blunder in US history, right? But because they have access to other markets, it allows them to generate profits and drive our firms out of business. So our firms are not competing in a market-based structure. It's an anti-market structure that our firms are competing against. So actually, if you believe in the market, if you believe that free market capitalism does create the most amount of wealth and prosperity for people, you need to have a structure that protects against their market manipulation and anti-market behavior. That's the sort of short answer, and I don't want to take too much time from everyone else.
Okay, well, we'll get back to all that, and then we'll use great cliches like "let's get the fox out of the hen house" and a million other things. But Liza, you've written and testified about what the U.S. is missing in its techno-economic rivalry with China. And can you give some context, I guess, from this historical perspective to how is it playing out today? And then how is the PRC operationalizing this sort of hybrid model that they've been perfecting and building over years in order to, I guess, succeed and then maybe cause us to fail?
Thanks, Robbie. Yeah, you started it off right by highlighting profit maximization as the operating principle that we assume. So for the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, they're maximizing for power. So it's power maximization. And it's not just economic power. It's economic, it's political, it's military, it's technological, it's even cultural and social. And they make that very clear in their documents. So I'll start by making what may seem like a very basic statement to build on what Rick has laid out. The Chinese Communist Party's approach to trade and economics is different from ours. To sum up everything Rick just told us, it's fundamentally different from the approach used in democratic market economies like the United States. The CCP is a Leninist regime. So some of the assumptions that we bring to trade and economics, things like profit maximization, level playing field, a common set of rules, the sanctity of contracts, independent courts, transparent information, those simply don't apply to China because it's a different kind of regime. We think of the ideas of comparative advantage. It's something that we learn in economic textbooks, and it's a helpful way to think about how international trade can allow countries to specialize, and it allows everyone to benefit. You can specialize in goods, the pie gets bigger, it's win-win. It's profit maximizing, it's a positive sum game. But when we're dealing with the CCP and with the PRC market, we have to keep in mind they're not going about this from a comparative advantage perspective. It's about absolute advantage for the state, for the PRC, the state, the party, and the national champions. And so these positive sum assumptions don't apply. So when I was thinking about this problem, I came up with just a little mnemonic, a little catchphrase for myself to describe this challenge: brute force economics. So this is just my own analytic frame to describe this broad range of practices we see the CCP pursuing to pursue its economic goals. So everything, all these things that are familiar from the news: intellectual property theft, massive subsidies that are far larger than those used in market-based economies, cyber intrusions to aid the state champions, unfair and abusive labor practices like forced labor, market access restrictions where foreign companies basically have to pay to play by turning over their technology and their IP, or else they're blocked out of the market. On and on and on, all of the things that our colleagues at USTR talk about. So this litany of malpractices that ranges across the board, I sum it up as brute force economics. So basically, you can think about this as mercantilism on steroids. Now, I want to pause for a minute because, of course, China isn't unique in using mercantilist tendencies. The United States has resorted to mercantilism at times. Some of our allies have. They're not unique. But what makes China unique, and why I call it brute force economics, is a combination of three characteristics. So the first is the most obvious. It's scale. China has the second largest economy in the world. We still have the largest market economy, but theirs is state-directed. So the state is able to wield the full power of the second largest economy in the world to pursue their objectives. The second characteristic of brute force economics is ruthlessness. What do I mean by that? That's that they talk a good game. They talk to third countries around the world about win-win development, about mutual cooperation, mutually beneficial cooperation. But in practice, it's all of these abusive practices that we've all become familiar with in the past. And then the third characteristic is, force. So what do I mean by that? So that's what Rick was describing of when our firms are competing with China, it's not firm versus firm competition. The CCP is able to wield the full force of the party, the state, the intelligence apparatus, the military, the SOEs, the quasi-private firms, the United Front operations around the world in this united effort to pursue national objectives. So you think about an individual American firm going up against the full weight of CCP Incorporated is just not a level playing field. So this idea of a fair competition, level playing field is kind of a mythical concept when it comes to China. So I'll quickly just give a case study. Huawei, we've all heard about it, but China over the years was able to wield brute force economics to give Huawei a leg up over its foreign competitors and enable it to become the largest vendor of telecommunications equipment in the world and put countries around the world really in a bind in terms of depending for this key critical infrastructure on a Leninist regime. So Huawei benefited from a lot of brute force economic practices, an estimated $75 billion in state support and subsidies over the years. And this is, dozens, probably hundreds of times more than the subsidies, the very paltry subsidies that Western telecommunications companies got. Market access restrictions, early on, companies like Ericsson, Nokia, and Cisco had a place in the Chinese market. But over time, as Huawei and other local Chinese firms rose in capability, those foreign firms were pushed out. And you see that pattern across the board in other sectors, that once the Chinese state is able to develop domestic champions, they push out the foreign competition and take over that market share. And then economic coercion. During COVID, Chinese wolf warrior diplomats were out threatening countries around the world. If you ban Huawei from your 5G network rollout due to national security concerns, you will not get COVID aid. You will not get our masks. So using those kind of coercive threats to forcibly gain market share overseas. There's a lot of other case studies that I think we'll probably get into after this. But back over to you, Robbie.
Can I ask a follow-up, which is, I guess ultimately their technology has to be good enough, and then they can use their market to force maybe a less good technology into the global sphere. Like, they have to be within the ballpark, so to speak. Is that true? Like, they just can't put out something that no one wants, and then so maybe share that thought on that.
I think it's an outdated notion that they can't innovate. That idea is several years out of date, and clearly on a number of technologies like electric vehicles, 5G network hardware, a few other areas they were ahead of us in testing hypersonic missiles. They are innovating and they're doing quite well. The TikTok algorithm. So this idea that a Leninist autocracy can't innovate is out of date. Scale has a power all its own. And China has done a masterful job at mastering process innovation, all of their investments in infrastructure, in education, in workforce over the years, and then blocking out the foreign competition. China is simply large enough for them to leverage that force.
Andy Grove once said to me, when he was alive, he once said to me that the reason he wanted to manufacture in the United States is because manufacturing itself is R&D. And that we forgot about that. We have this sort of notion like we learned in a university in a lab. And I think that that's really telling on batteries, for example, right? The amount of innovation that has gone in just because of their experience in building these things and what they've learned while building them. And so it's like sort of the worst of both worlds. They not only have the market size, but then they have this ability to both innovate so they can force even a better product. So
yeah, it's a great point. I mean, innovation can happen at the design level, and the United States is really good at that, but it also happens at the process level on the factory floor, and China has really mastered that, and the United States needs to relearn those lessons.
Absolutely. So actually, I'm going to skip to David. David, you were actually the one who taught me when this all was going on with Alibaba and everything, and I was like, oh, they would never do that. Exactly what Rick said. I was like, oh, come on, they wouldn't take away billions of dollars. It's an incredibly successful company, and why would they even try that? And you said, Robbie, they're not profit maximizing. She has a totally different view of what he wants or doesn't want. So I actually will It's great that you're here because you opened my mind to a different way of thinking. So you're at the State Department, actually at the time, I think, where the United States was waking up to this issue in an even more profound way. And so you worked to reorient U.S. policy towards China in the Pacific. So you've been in the trenches. And how do you think we're fighting back, and is it working?
Well, they're great questions, and thanks for doing this all together, Robbie. During my time at the State Department, we worked hard, harder than would have been ideal, to observe just how much China's grand strategy is about gaining economic and technological leverage over the United States and our friends. There is much greater recognition of that today, as this discussion is demonstrating, than there was 7 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. There was a process of needing to rethink and really, in many cases, shatter a whole series of myths about China that had been serving us terribly as a U.S. Community broadly, the business community, the strategic community, the democratic world in general. And those myths included that China's Leninist system would not serve it economically, would necessarily mean that China over time would look like the Soviet Union in terms of economic incompetence and political frailty. We needed to learn not to over-apply the lessons of the Soviet experience to China, not because there aren't really important insights in the Soviet experience, not because there aren't crucial inefficiencies and frailties to authoritarian and communist systems, but simply because China would not necessarily go the Soviet way. And in fact, the evidence over years was that China was continually outpacing our expectations, economically, politically, technologically, and otherwise. And so we spent a lot of time, including with colleagues like all those up here, simply educating ourselves and then educating others in Washington and trying to help discuss with others around the world that China actually was following a grand strategy focused on offensive leverage against us, focused really on making China into a kind of super OPEC for the 21st century, a single country OPEC that would be able to control the inputs for the modern economy almost entirely on its own. And that this wasn't just China's ambition, but that China was succeeding far greater than our assumptions and models had predicted before. And so that awakening was really very important. And we're all now kind of working through what it means, including what it means specifically in sectors like green technologies and semiconductors that are, especially like, say, oil in the OPEC analogy, right? The sorts of things that will be at the absolute basis of future economic and technological power, especially, say, if countries continue to follow through with all sorts of green energy transition goals. The importance of not allowing China to wield supply chain control and technological commanding heights control over these areas is really very crucial. And so to quickly perhaps answer the question and tick down sort of what we're doing and how we're doing, I think the answer is that we are making progress, but not nearly enough and not nearly as quickly as probably we need to. And so the things that have happened over the last 7 years or so that really are notable and are significant include significant adjustments to trade policy, significant adjustments to recognizing that there is a core set of technologies that are hugely strategically significant that we cannot trust adversaries to provide us over time. Those include 5G telecommunications, semiconductors, and other areas. That the manufacture of them is not something that we can simply rely on in a purely globalized supply chain way, as if all countries are the same and getting critical inputs from our adversaries is the same as getting critical inputs from our friends or from ourselves. And so that's been real progress. And there's been real progress in aspects of domestic industrial policy where, especially in the last few years, lawmakers and the administration have worked together to begin aspects of industrial policy in semiconductors and in other crucial areas that will be central to this competition with China. The problem is that all of this work is basically immature, early stage. Some of it is, still has results that are coming in and are yet to be determined, and a lot of it is really actually just notional. And we don't have forever. And the passage of years is quite significant when we're talking about the relative dependencies that we have, when we're talking about how this applies not just to our economic prosperity and our economic security, but to our national security. And actually, if you'll indulge me, I'll make a point on defense policy in a moment that I think crucially relates to matters of economic and technology competition and competence as well. But to look just quickly on kind of what is to be done to advance all these areas where we're still in a fairly immature and in some ways just notional sense. We've mentioned semiconductors. Especially since October of 2022, the US has had fairly notable and strong restrictions on the export of semiconductor technology at the advanced nodes of semiconductor manufacturing to keep China from being able to compete with us at that especially important part of the global technology landscape. But in legacy semiconductors, we are still right now in the process of becoming highly dependent on China in the years to come. The Biden administration, with its tariffs, has recently made a very significant symbolic move in increasing the Trump administration's tariffs on imported legacy semiconductors. The problem is these tariffs are largely irrelevant because we don't import many semiconductors as such. Semiconductors come to us from China as components inside other goods. And until and unless we find a policy instrument to address that, we will continue on this path of having this basic input of commodity semiconductors all across our economy, in our cars, in our Internet of Things equipment, in our medical devices, and everything else coming increasingly from China and subject to the sort of strategic coercion and leverage that gives China. On critical minerals, our dependencies are getting worse. On pharmaceuticals, our dependencies are getting worse. They're getting even no better despite the COVID pandemic. On electric vehicles, we might get into that in some detail. There is a lot of action there and a lot of importance. There's a lot of significance to the fact that the Trump administration placed tariffs on Chinese cars, including electric vehicles, at 25%. The Biden administration has now increased those to 100% to really try to keep Chinese cars from flooding the US market. But there are national security considerations with a Commerce Department probe that's important on this issue. And there are questions about how Chinese companies like BYD, which have emerged to be far more innovative and competent competitors to US firms, Tesla and otherwise, are now setting up manufacturing in Mexico and Korea and other third countries where their goods, their cars would be able to come into the US tariff-free. And so in all these areas, a lot of folks know rare earths. I would just say quickly, rare earths came to people's attention, especially around 2011, when the Chinese placed export restrictions on rare earths going to Japan. At the time, Japan and the US and much of the world were more than 95% dependent on China for rare earths. Japan, over the last 13 years, has taken its dependency down considerably, but it's still about 60%. The US dependency might not be down under 95. So the awakening that we think we've been going through is in some ways really very shallow and immature, and it really does need to get better. And I'll quickly here end on the point about defense spending. It's not really the part of our conversation that is about economic and technological matters directly. But there's an important debate going on with respect to China and the national security risk and what sort of posture does the US need to deter China's increasingly hostile ambitions toward us, toward Taiwan, et cetera. And part of the challenge that we've seen in having US policy, unfortunately, for decades that did not realize the importance of manufacturing at home around, say, telecom and microelectronics, was also allowing a hollowing out of our defense industrial base, our munitions industrial base. And this question of whether that can be fixed and whether it can be fixed without a major increase in defense spending is a huge political question that relates to power and competition with China. There's just been a move from the leading Republican on the Senate Armed Services Committee to call for increasing defense spending dramatically. He called for a generational increase to 5% of our GDP over the next few years from a declining share of 3% now. And that too is well worth considering in this context.
Yeah, I mean, we like to talk about that whatever is in an F-150 Lightning electric vehicle are the exact same things in an F-35. And we can get to that in a minute, how the commercial size and scale really helps the military that might not have the same scale of what they need, but they're the same thing. But I have a quick, you are a Wall Street Journal reporter from the past, so maybe you understand business on this panel. My question to you is this, like, okay, but there is money to be made. Like, why don't our companies go do that? Go mine, go build a chip, for legacy chips, or, okay, there's a little money to be made. Like, wouldn't our money, our capital chase it? What are they scared of will happen and China will do? It just seems crazy. There's a demand for something. Why isn't someone going to do it, build it here or in Europe or somewhere else in the world?
There are many big problems there. I'll try to name two quickly. The first is that we oriented far too much of our investment, including from our leading companies, to go into China and to be entangled in the coercive and Leninist power of the Chinese Communist Party in ways that were hugely damaging. So we overdid it on China in ways that were often actually valuable for corporate profits on a quarter-to-quarter and year-to-year framework, and that is how we incented our companies to make decisions, but it didn't align with the national interest, and we've all been waking up to that over time. So now the question is, if not China, why not here? And the answer there, to a very significant degree, is also China, which is that as long as these Chinese origin and Chinese refined critical minerals, for example, have access to the US market, there's going to be a real challenge in ever making domestic US or, say, Canadian production economic. And so it raises, I think, the necessity to consider more aggressive measures that deny the US market altogether to many of these inputs from China, because it's important to try to compete with tariffs. It might be important to try to compete with subsidies, but those are all basically competing on price. And a lot of what China has been able to accumulate over time is so much of a price advantage that that's a losing game for us unless we and our allies find ways to deny our markets to China, because we, especially collectively with our allies, have enormous market power. Something like 60% or more of global GDP is the US, Europe, and Japan. And aligning that, which I should have noted a moment ago, among the things we haven't done quite enough in the last 7 years is figure out how to align with the other key economies, including the Europeans and the Japanese. There's a lot of complex diplomacy and politics there, obviously, but it really is important for getting the heft to counter what China has accumulated, what we've allowed China to accumulate over some 40 years.
You use my favorite phrase, OPEC. I like to say that China is actually OPEC squared. And it's not a coalition of people who have to make a decision, usually clumsily, but it's one that has way more power than any one country ever had in oil. Also, in oil, there's a price discovery market that we can all see. It's very well defined, where these minerals, for example, are very opaque on how they're priced and where, and they just have total power. And I think that's really important to think about, how this country has suffered over time due to cartelistic behavior. But now you have a cartel of one who really can make every decision and flood the market. I'm just going to use one example for the people here. Like, let's just take a mine. So there's a mine here in the United States for cobalt that they wanted to open up. China, that owns basically the cobalt market, both from around the world, owning the mines and then processes everything there, floods the market. And then they flood the market, and the mine that we were going to open up in Idaho decides, okay, we're not going to do that anymore. So their manipulation, and by the way, they don't even have to do it. They just have to do it once. And then every private company in the United States and in the Western world will say, I don't need that. I'll never be able to win and compete. So I think it's really profoundly scary, their ability to, again, if they're not profit maximizing. Someone once said about home run hitters, it's much easier to hit a home run to a part of the field where no one is, because someone's, because if you don't hit a home run, you'll at least get a hit. And so having the Chinese Communist Party behind every company, they're able to take risks and do things that no private company here in the United States or around the Western world can. So let's turn to Adam and go to the sort of we all hear about Belt and Roads and what they do this, and we have the EXIM Bank, which is much older than Belt and Roads, and clearly doesn't do the exact same thing. So just get a sense of the playing field for U.S. companies. around the world, and what you saw and how you tried to help, and billions have been spent on these efforts. Give us some insight into how this is playing out in the global markets, and where is it working, where is it not working?
Happy to, Robbie. And again, before I do substance, I got to compliment Feith and you for pulling a panel like this together. With my colleagues on the panel, Rick, I learned some more history every time we talk. And it's probably unintentional, but a fantastic segue from some of what David and Liza
Adam,
were saying.
what we're trying to do is we don't want this issue to be like we're QAnon.
Right.
But there's some conspiracy theory out there, we're all nuts. So this is supposed
Absolutely
to
not.
make it like normal people can
why we're
they're
bantering.
acting rationally. We're acting rationally. We're just acting different.
Absolutely. Well, because the reason I pay these compliments is because you really can't understand global trade and the way trade finance is working across borders to support U.S. businesses or those of friends of allies without this background and context. So some of the points of what is behind every deal. Why is it that when Nokia or other 5G producers show up to compete for a market and the Chinese competitor is 30% lower in price before you even get to the cost of financing to finance the deal? It's because you have all these things in a protected home market that are being supported by the Communist Party in the background that are enabling to then go out. It was actually the name of the policy was going out once upon a time before it became Belt and Road, to go out into those third country markets to compete for market share, get the revenue profits, and bring it back for the home market. So what I'd like to add for folks, so when I spent 3 years at EXIM on the front lines, trying to help U.S. businesses find ways to compete against the PRC. And so what I'd offer to the folks at home is that when you think about your business and you're thinking about how do I export and compete in third country markets, not just here in the U.S., one thing you should do is I would ignore the myths of what is called peak China. So there are the people that are saying out there, Belt and Road financing has been drying up, they're not going overseas anymore, it's all slowing down. Surely this thing will resolve itself just like it did, like any inefficient market will be resolved over time. And I'd encourage you, the information on what the PRC is doing is notoriously difficult. I've seen all the commercial resources. There are others available in academia, particularly from William and Mary. But in general, the Chinese still remain today, even after all this supposed pullback, the largest overseas lender by a single country. And that includes both overseas development assistance, what we in the West daily think of as aid, things from my colleagues at the Development Finance Corporation or others, or what we call other overseas flows, like export credits or other government programs or lending programs that help foster foreign trade. So at best estimates from the last couple of years, it's still flowing at about $80 billion a year of Chinese financing to support PRC firms that are going out and competing against you for third country market share. And the other thing I'd ask you to leave you with is that the competition is very real. So from everything that the folks up here are saying, I got to see it firsthand with US businesses, foreign businesses, allies and partners, US banks, foreign banks, and other export credit agencies, that it's very real. And if your idea that, oh, clearly they're just ham-fisted and they'll screw it up, I'll tell you that they're learning and they're doing things much better. Some simple examples of that would be, for instance, they're having more and more transactions done in RMB instead of dollar. Now, a lot of folks would say, oh, that's about diminishing the power of the dollar, but it's also about alleviating the foreign exchange reserves that your foreign buyers need to have. Because if it's in RMB, you can have a better negotiation. They don't have to retain as many dollars in their capital accounts in order to pay back lending if the transaction is done in RMB. You're seeing less and less of their policy banks in the front, and you're seeing more and more of the commercial banks. So as Rick was pointing out, if the party maintains control over the whole system, and they won't allow the factors of production to sort of slip out of the control of the party, what you're seeing is the normal ones you'd expect is China EXIM or Sinosure, which is an insurance firm, or even China Development Bank to be leading. What you could see over time is that actually they are definitely playing a very important role, but it's actually the state banks, so ICBC or others that are sort of Chinese, ostensibly publicly traded Chinese banks, are actually taking a lot of the lead in trade finance, and they're just being backed up by insurance from the official flow. So you're seeing a more commercial front. And the other thing you're seeing is you're seeing less bilateral, sort of like Chinese lending to a third country to buy Chinese goods and services, and you're seeing participation more through multilateral or working with Western firms and banks. So you'll see a Western or an Asian or a European bank sort of doing the lead organizer for the lending, and you'll see that behind that it's enabling PRC goods and services, but it's being insured by the Chinese. And lastly, what I'll say is a lot of folks will say, yeah, but ESG, gosh darn it, when the PRC shows up and they do work in a country like the ESG ramifications are high, I'd say yes, and they're getting much better. You're seeing them bring in Western Standards and other folks to come in and help improve the ESG performance of a lot of the projects overseas, but they're still able to do it at speed. so they can start to increase slowly the ESG standards that they're using, though not to the standards that many would like. And they're able still to do it much faster than many of the Western counterparts would do. So the competition is very real, but I would want to make sure that I actually think we're going to win over the long run. And the reason why is that a lot of the things that David was mentioning and Liza's mentioned, the ship is beginning to turn, the Titanic has started to move, and people are less afraid to talk about some of the things they're seeing. And there's now an intellectual baseline around which people can rally and say, hey, that's not quite right, what I'm seeing overseas. I'd also say you have a very large number of very hardworking civil servants across the federal branch of the US government, let alone at the state level, Development Finance Corporation, EXIM Bank, USTDA, Millennium Challenge Corporation. They are struggling every day. They're working 80, 90 hours a week, trying to find ways that the US government can help be part of the solution. But it is hard. And as David was saying, we're very immature in we're at the beginning of understanding how to compete against these things. And the last thing I'd say is that on that same front, the bloom is off the rose, I think, on a lot of PRC lending. You don't need to explain to a lot of your third country buyers or in these third country markets like, hey, there's risk there. Hey, there's a possible problem with it. I think the State Department's done an exceptional job of getting a lot of that message out. But you still need to show up with an alternative. You can't just say the answer to the risks of Huawei is you don't get cell phones or you don't get a 5G network. There have to be alternatives that are provided so that they can help come onto these better systems. And that's where a lot of both our own domestic policies as well as our alliance with our friends and allies and working in concert together with each other are going to work. So you're asking me what's working and what's not working. What I learned from a few years on the front lines of this is that I think it doesn't work when we try to out-China China. By which I mean, you say, well, they have industrial policy and they have state-backed lending and they have all these approaches. I need to do more of that. And if I'm just more like them, that's how we'll win. My counterposition would be like, we do need to be more like us. And when you look back at our history at times where we have used either tax policy or incentive structures to help nurture and foster a market-based economy, and we have to be more like us to help push those sorts of things. And when we compete, we don't need to compete in third countries for influence. Like we're out there to say, well, we need to do this deal because of influence. If you're competing for influence, I think you're in a bottomless, you're going down a slope that never ends. I would contend what we need to do is competing for customers. You need to show up and recognize, I understand that the other guy has backing. What other ways can the US government or financial, how do we buy down risk, bring better products in, and actually fight and compete for that market share? And it's going to be a hard slog. I do believe that fundamentally there's a role for the executive branch of the federal government to play in this, because nobody can buy down risk at scale in our system like the federal branch can. However, we don't want to lose who we are in this process. We're not going to try to out-China China in some of these areas.
So let me ask this question, and all of you can answer, or one of you can answer. But if you had to say to, let me pick three parties. We're on the Hill here, and then I'll go to the Europeans. Democrats say, we need these solar panels, these wind turbines, and these electric vehicles today. They'll cost a little more because of our standards, and we don't have time because we have an existential problem. And we should just get cheap products from China and use them. What would you say to them? Republicans say, okay, maybe we need it for military equipment, but we don't need battery. We don't have the electric vehicles, and we shouldn't actually help prime the pump, create a market for these new technologies. And so, okay, I'm fine with doing some industrial policy, but not that industrial policy. That's a crazy liberal idea. What would you say to them, and why they're mad? And then the Europeans, well, I don't know what they say. But for the most part, there's still the WTO crowd, although that's shifted, I think, in the last few months. But let's pick the German auto industry, right? And they're about to put tariffs on too, and they're actually pushing the most back. So on one hand, you'd say to yourself, okay, at some point their profit merry-go-round is going to end. What are they doing? They should actually, really do this now. What would you say to the Europeans who are still, I think, living in a slightly different, world than we think? So I don't know if you want to take all three or you want to pick one of them, but what would you say to those people who are just seeing the world wrong, maybe from your perspective?
I'll jump on the Republican one because I think the supply chain is critical when it goes where David was talking about. And you can take any one of these things, but let's take electric vehicles, for instance, right? The electric vehicles, if you have a economies of scope and scale production of electric vehicles in the United States, meaning the vast majority of the components are produced here in the United States, what that gives you now is rare earth processing. What that gives you is permanent magnets. There are the number of permanent magnets in any vehicle, military vehicle, in our satellites, in our other sort of high-tech components throughout the board are enormous, right? We don't produce those right now because there isn't an anchor, right? The anchor for that, it's just cheaper. With 95% of neodymium permanent magnets come from the PRC, which is part of an industrial policy that started with state-backed funding for the rare earth processing. That then they backed they put export restrictions on the rare earths that forced folks to bring their permanent magnet production into the PRC. They then use that to gain access to motors, right? So all of these things tie together. So if you want to have a military that's capable of fielding, vehicles that are also cutting edge, but also don't cost 50 times more than the PRC equivalent, right? So a U.S. drone, that would be the equivalent of a DJI drone, a very high-end militarized DJI drone, is going to be, if you had to produce all of it in the United States, is going to be 10 or 20 times as expensive. And so if the future of warfare is networked, autonomous, and intelligent, the country that can field 1 million super cheap weaponized drones that will be based upon this electric vehicle market. Without the electric vehicle market, you don't have the economies of scope and scale to then funnel low-cost, highly efficient produced components into these other markets. And so that's why I would say and I could go down for the solar, there's a connection to semiconductors. For wind turbines, there's a connection to a bunch of other things. All of these giant commercial markets, you have to have them. You don't have a constituency, for instance, for climate change if you're the Democrats. You don't have the industrial base for national security if you're the Republicans. And in the end, buying from China is buying the most polluted products in the world because they are the only people who use coal to make aluminum. So forget everything else. Just the aluminum housing is made with coal. Nobody in the world would use coal-fired power for aluminum.
Yeah, we basically launder their coal into much of our
We do.
products. But let me just hit that point. So if you did not believe in climate change, you would still do these things? That's what
Of course, you won't have the economy of the future. You can't rebuild all the things that Dave was talking about if you don't have the anchor market. And the anchor market for processing rare earths, for magnets, for motors, for all these other things that you need is really going to be the electric vehicle.
And then the next one is, okay, but some people say, like, we are now energy independent, although I would discuss what that means. We drill for this oil. We have internal combustion engines, which we continue to lead on. Like, why would we, the Chinese are forcing us into a battle for a new technology that people, one, don't want, or two, again, I'm just trying to lay out some of the things I hear and get your answer. You pick the Republicans. I don't know if someone's going to pick someone else.
I'll speak to all three.
Okay.
So whether you care about the green revolution or the technology revolution, the AI revolution, or the economic revolution, we're living through a few right now, a geopolitical revolution. No matter which one you care about, there is a value to maintaining some control and some choice over the green technologies, the digital technologies that are part of our life. So there's value. If we've learned anything from the past 5 years, from COVID, from Russia, Ukraine, from the generative AI boom, is that there is both economic value and national security value to maintaining some agency and control over where those things are made.
Okay, so I'm sorry.
If I could pile on top, I'd say one of the really important things that Rick was pointing out is because all the examples you gave were looking at sort of the product or the commodity level. What about tanks? What about this? I think what's really important about what Rick is bringing up is that you do got to look at these things as value chains. Because if you just look at the final end product, you're missing the dependencies that work all the way up. And those are the hard lessons we've been learning since COVID, since Russia, Ukraine, since others, is that, oh my goodness, it's actually, as you keep walking back, you find yourself talking about neodymium magnets when all I wanted to do was to make sure we had more electric vehicles on the road. So anytime somebody comes to you and says, well, I don't care about that particular issue, I would recommend broaden your aperture, think a little bit more about a value chain and the supply chains that go with them.
So let's go to the Democrats who say, like, we just need these products now. For example, our foreign entity of concern provision that is not allowed has been watered down in order to allow these products. And now we don't have time to build a supply chain. We have an existential, climate crisis in their eyes. Does someone want to answer that?
Well, I think among the concerns there is that there needs to be demonstrated, I think, from that camp, a coherent argument why the policies they're pursuing are actually going to be sufficient to close what they say are the existential global environmental gaps that we have in the trajectory of a heavily carbon-based economy. as far as I've heard, I've never heard an explanation for how actually the policy mix that is being recommended across various iterations of the Green New Deal even can accomplish what is ostensibly being advertised. And meanwhile, it is having the very real and immediate effect of making us subject to the strategic coercion of our adversaries today and tomorrow in very real and demonstrable terms. So there's a real gap in arguments that are still kind of notional, speculative, and hard to add up the numbers for, especially, say, in an election year when the American people are going to be adding up numbers, on the one hand, versus, on the other hand, a sense that there's a whole lot of initiatives being pushed in the United States and in allied countries that are trading what feels a lot like energy independence on the traditional economy for strategic dependence on China, of all foreign countries, going forward. And I think that until there's an explanation for that, I think the argument, Robbie, that you kind of gave voice to, which is that America has a great strength in internal combustion engines, what in the world are we doing pressing this dramatic shift, is going to be a very hard sell with voters. And I think we're going to see that very prominently in the campaign going forward.
But if I may, I was the Environment, Science, Technology, and Health Counselor in Embassy Beijing. I worked for a Chinese environmental NGO in 1999 and 2000 as the only foreigner in an all-Chinese office. I've been to the settling ponds, for instance, in Inner Mongolia, right? I've seen how they process and manufacture these things, right? So China added more coal-fired power in the last 24 months than the United States has total. So if we were to take the entire revolution and we would apply it and we would zero out all American coal, then 24 months later, China would have added it, right? And so because their entire industrial economy is built upon sort of this notion of accumulating national power, right? Things like soil pollution are state secrets. Quite literally, we had an NGO we worked with, the person got arrested for trying to publish publicly the soil pollution. 60% of the groundwater in some provinces in China are unfit for human contact, not consumption, contact, right? And so when you look at this, if you're creating this dependency on green energy products from China, you're actually reinforcing a globally polluting industrial base, right? And so you'll never get out of this trap, right? If you want to get out of this trap, then the way to get out of it is to make sure that the United States and Germany and other places where very stringent environmental regulations, where you're already using a much cleaner industrial energy base on top of all these other things, so that what you end up getting is a net positive. And tying yourself to the most polluting industrial base on the planet, which has no interest in reducing their coal firepower. Right? They're not even going to peak by their own admissions. They're not going to peak carbon emissions until 2030, right? This was the deal. This was the great deal that we got out of China. Like the climate change negotiations, when I worked with 25 years ago at a Chinese environmental NGO, when Kyoto came out, the entire office of Chinese environmental activists were opposed to Kyoto. Why? Because they knew all Kyoto was going to mean was that pollution in Europe and pollution in the United States was going to be China's pollution. And they were concerned about the local people in the provinces having to breathe polluted air. Lancet put out an article a few years ago that showed that 10 million people die prematurely every year from air pollution alone. That doesn't even bring in soil pollution, all the other things. So my point is that you've got the most environmentally damaging industrial base on the planet, and you're going to try to greenwash that through maybe getting 3 months ahead on the U.S.'s clean energy transition. It seems to me that you're undermining the entire process and logic behind what you're pushing for.
I think David wanted to say something.
Well, we talked earlier about sort of the need to move toward what would probably be effective import bans on aspects of what China is currently exporting into the United States and Europe and elsewhere. Our systems aren't really designed to pursue import bans because of, among other things, the catastrophic mistake of the WTO accession of China 25 years ago. But the three broad areas where in the US and in Europe and in Japan, in different ways and in only gradual and...
We had Korea and Australia.
Happily.
Thank you.
The different ways that these countries, given shared values and shared interests, are beginning kind of fitfully to move toward the ability to place appropriate bans. The three categories are basically on national security grounds that include data security and cybersecurity, because technology that we get from China faces these unmitigable challenges because of the access of the Chinese Communist Party to any systems, any data that flow along those technologies. There's the national security grounds. There are human rights grounds, including especially around forced labor and what would be in the US system a more robust enforcement of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in the years ahead. And the third category, obviously more of interest in Europe today than it is in Washington, is on carbon intensity grounds. Because for the reasons that Rick said, any proper recognition, if what you're really trying to control for is carbon emissions, would not look to China as a solution for anything on environmental grounds.
Yeah, no, I think we've talked here about how opaque supply chains are very good for authoritarian regimes. And that really transparency, which is what we are about, which allows our free press, our regulatory state to enforce, we need to know what's happening from the mine or the wellhead all the way to the final product, and we infuse our values and have independent border inspectors. We win. We all might pay a little more. Like, I'm not here to sugarcoat that, but if we do that with our allies, we're all doing it together. So I think transparency is just so key here. I guess we're a little over, but we're able. I think everyone can stay for one more question. Let me ask this question. So the United States, I would argue, at the moment has really had mostly a strategy of throwing money at this, subsidies, tax credits, et cetera. What structural things do we need to do? You've talked about the ban of letting things in, so you can re-mention that. But really, I guess my question is, they have unlimited bank accounts in some ways. They're protected here. Like, over time, this money is going to run out. And yet we see that they understand how our quarter-to-quarter reporting system works in our markets. They're using our markets against us in some ways. So what would you structurally say we need to do, and how important is to get to the structural issues? Yes, we need to continue to put money into it, but we need to do more.
Yeah, I think David hit it pretty well. He mentioned it many times, but I'll just sort of restate what he said. That there's sort of two fundamental factors. One is we have the biggest markets in the world, right? We need to do a much better job of bringing our partners and allies together and saying, look, here are the things we can't afford to lose, right? Here are the things we can't afford to be dependent upon. And so you can't out-subsidize them. As I said earlier, the government controls 70% of the economy, right? You can't win a subsidies war against these guys. So first you have to say, here's a time frame, 3 years, 2 years, 4 years. The market, understand, if you want to sell into this market, then you're going to have to source it through transparent supply chains that do not run through the PRC for semiconductors, for telecommunications, for cloud computing, for quantum, for biotech, right? There's a whole list of them. We don't care. I don't care about prams and tennis shoes and things like that. Fine. They want to subsidize and make sure I have a cheap baby carriage. That's great. But the things that matter for national security, new energy vehicles and these, we need to create that not just Fortress America market. We need to create a market where free market competition is the order of the day. And so firms that are going to compete on free, fair, open, transparent, sort of market-based conditions are welcome in our market, and our firms would then be welcome in their market. But you have to sort of start there. And then, because we're so far behind, as David has mentioned several times, because we don't have the time to lose, there is a role for subsidies. There's a role for industrial policy in order to rebuild the capacities. These are not industrial policies that should last forever. These are not meant to be market manipulating and walling out foreign competition. This is saying economies that are non-market based, that are predatory, don't get access to these things. And we're going to have to, in order to get the profit structure right, to get the risk levels right, we're going to have to put a little money into it, because we have to make up for about $10 trillion in unrealized investment. Quite literally, we probably have not invested, and that's probably a low ball, at least $10 trillion in investment, in production, in infrastructure in this country that did not take place between the accession to WTO and today. And so there's no free lunch. We're going to have to, there's no easy way out of this. As you said, it's not going to be cheaper. I'm not going to lie to you, right? It's not going to be free. We're going to have to pay for it. But where you end up is a much more secure, economically stable, a growing middle class that isn't addicted to fentanyl, which is coming in from the PRC, right? So, I mean, this is a holistic approach to rebuilding our economy and rebuilding our global strength.
You had to throw fentanyl in at the end, the whole new topic. Anyone else want to take the structural issues?
Yeah, I think we're all coalescing around this idea of markets. And the US has the world's biggest market. We account for about a quarter of the world's GDP. But even that is not always enough. And so we have to pool our market demand with other democratic market economies around the world. And together, if we wall it off in strategic areas, prohibit unfair Chinese competition from tainting those markets, together we can succeed. And just one more point, the current reigning paradigm, this sort of dying thinking of global multilateral trade, where every member of the WTO agrees to reduce trade barriers, that kind of emerged in the 1990s and has been the reigning paradigm ever since. It hasn't succeeded for years. And so what is the next paradigm? And the United States really needs to be leading there. And that hasn't always been the reigning paradigm. It's only been around for a few decades. And so we can look to previous history, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and this idea of managing trade with our adversaries. I mean, we had some very limited managed trade with states in the Soviet orbit during the Cold War. We don't have to cut it all off, as Rick pointed out, but we can manage it so that we're operating these things based on our own interests. So lower the barriers with allies and partners and raise them with the PRC.
Basically, we're all pro-free traders, just free traders amongst people who are
people who
competing,
follow the rules.
who follow the rules, and you can take them to court to follow the rules.
Which is the Bretton Woods approach, and was how we defined free trade until the 90s, when we got a little overexcited.
So we need to go back to Wayne's World, woo, 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 at 2001 and before.
I'm going to foot stomp something Liza said that is really, really important for anyone paying attention today, which was, I don't even think we have the right language to describe what's coming next. And so a lot of thinking and words need to be spent on the frameworks and the paradigms to define what we want the 21st century to look like, because that will drive everything. I really want to make sure that I think where we are in the journey of understanding this problem, and again, the events like this and a lot of other things happening around Washington, around the country today, are about us beginning to think through a lot of these issues. And I think one of the major outputs that needs to come are new paradigms and new frameworks for thinking about what is in our interest, how do we promote trade. On a very tactical point on the structural question, I'll only offer, I think at the end of the day, speaking only from a finance point of view, I think the role of the executive branch of the federal government in the economy, from a finance point of view, it's going to start looking something like insurance and guarantees, right? Where what the federal government isn't actually loaning monies directly out, and we're not actually subsidizing all the time, but what it's doing is it's guaranteeing commercially viable loans that are maybe just a little above the risk factor that the market would take. We'll guarantee that to encourage activity to happen that pushes your risk just a little bit further than when the market would naturally go, but not so far that we're playing poker with U.S. taxpayer money.
So, and this is really the last question. I don't know if it ends on a hopeful note, but many people have said, like, they're not 10 feet tall. They make mistakes too. I don't know. Maybe someone can give an example of, like, we've made it sound so perfect. They've chosen the right things. They're going everywhere in the world, and we're a bunch of, like, incompetent buffoons that don't have a strategy, can't get our act together, and we have tens of thousands of bureaucrats running around, and yet they've got a single point of person who's just thought this through. I don't know. So maybe, like I've always said, in some ways, I've come to discover I'm coming up on a big birthday. So in my years, like,
30?
Yep, exactly. It feels to me like the country that scores on themselves the least is going to actually win. So maybe, like, we could just take them down one peg on that. And David, you look like you want to do that.
I'll take the bait. I think, look, in the last few years, there have been certain successes out of China that have been bracing for all of us. We've talked a lot about, say, electric vehicles and BYD that generates a lot of headlines, in the last few months. But actually, in the last 3-4 years, since COVID especially, we've seen a series of major political decisions out of Beijing that are more Soviet style and self-defeating, probably, than decisions that the Chinese Communist Party had been making for a long time. The zero COVID lockdown policy was a major example. The very aggressive crackdown on the Chinese tech sector was another. It destroyed an enormous amount of value. It turned off a lot of foreign investors. It probably crushed, maybe for years to come, a lot of the animal spirits of talented Chinese who were taking risk and applying their genius in China to Chinese companies for the last 20 years, seeing what happened to Jack Ma and a lot of others. Those sorts of moves out of the current Xi Jinping government in Beijing are the kind of self-defeating thing that might make the argument for kind of sitting back and allowing China to go and make these mistakes in the way that so much Soviet policy was self-defeating for the Soviets. And yet, we don't know whether the next 30 years from China are going to look like the last 3 or 4 years, or say like the last 30 to 40. Because over the last 30 to 40 years, China's policymaking generally outpaced our expectations. And we were very poorly served by underestimating them. And so I think there's an argument for recognizing when they trip, recognizing that they have inefficiencies and stupidities and frailties and terrible repression in their politics. But so far, actually, in the long term, we've been underestimating them. It's hurt us enormously, and we probably should stop doing it going forward.
Like I said, one thing, I think the law of large numbers will catch up with them eventually. The problem is our markets have been so open to them that they are able to paper over their own domestic. So their overcapacity is a great example, right? If they were really only selling to their own domestic market, all the steel and now the vehicles and all the other things that they're producing, firms, even with the subsidies, would have to go out of business, right? There would just be no way to maintain this ridiculous level of overcapacity. Steel's a very good one. Running at full bore, China can produce as much steel as the entire planet combined, right? They're 18% of the world's population. They don't need to do that, but because they can get access to these markets, the problem is they are. If we let this continue for long enough, we will enter a period where they will be too big to fail, and they will bring the entire global economy down with them. Like left to the current trajectory of taking market after market after market with overcapacity after overcapacity, eventually they will exhaust the foreign markets, right? When they exhaust the foreign markets to continue to play this sort of Ponzi scheme of overcapacity, at some point the model fails. And when the model fails in that world, the model where we're trying to prescribe is we wall ourselves off, we protect ourselves, we protect our markets, we create our own resiliency. But if we wait until their market fails of its own weight, they're going to take us all down with them. And so, this is preserving the global economy in a lot of ways as well, not just U.S. national security. They will eventually, these policies will build. I mean, they cannot defy gravity. They can't break the laws of economics, right? At some point, overinvesting into industrial capacity beyond what the global market can bear will lead to a collapse. And they'll be too big to fail and take us down with them if we don't do something.
And if we're still integrated, we will collapse with them. Yep. But if we've successfully divested ourselves from them, we'll be more likely to survive that crash.
Wow. So it feels like a therapy session in some ways for all of us who actually, again, wanted to dispel the QAnon myth that we have everything's a conspiracy out there. I think we did a good job at that. Thank you very much. Does anyone have anything final that they'd like to say to get it off your chests? Okay, well, my wife has been complaining that movies are too long these days. She'd rather a 90-minute quick movie than a 3-hour movie. So we'll have to stop here. But thank you all. Hopefully, we'll see you at our next episode, which will be in July. It will be on China's industrial policy and the impact on key industries. So thank you all so much for joining me. Thank you for teaching me over the years, and I look forward to working with you in the future.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.